Ladies and gentlemen, welcome everyone. I'm Grzegorz Ekiert. I'm the director of the Center and professor of government, and it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this very special event. As you know, this year we celebrate the 50th anniversary of founding of the Center for European Studies. From a very small program which was started by Henry Kissinger many years ago, these institutions became quite big and quite opulent, as you see from the surroundings. And this event is one of a series of events which were designed to celebrate our 50th anniversary. And what we do from time to time, because we have such capacity and opportunity, we try to combine the artistic event with intellectual debate, and this one is precisely of that kind. When Professor Karplus showed us his images of Yugoslavia, I realized that we haven't done anything on Yugoslavia for quite some time. I still remember big discussions in the 90s, but for the last 15 years or so, Yugoslavia became a forgotten country. And I thought that there was great opportunity really to do something on this. I would like to thank the staff of the Center for European Studies for their hard work on preparing both this panel discussion and the exhibit. Let me just mention Vasilis Koutifaris and Gila Naderi, who took a lead on organizing this. Now, this afternoon we began with the panel discussion. Then we'll have opening of the exhibit, and then all of you are invited for the reception, which will take place upstairs in the atrium. I have to tell you that this event is recorded, so if you miss something, you can always go back and listen to the tape, watch the tape of the event. Now, it's my great pleasure to welcome three distinguished experts on former Yugoslavia. Marie-Janine Kalik is a professor of Eastern and Southern Eastern European history at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. She's also visiting professor at the College of Europe. She's an expert on modern Balkan history, and her recent books include The Great Cauldron, The History of Southeast Europe, and The History of Yugoslavia. Professor Kalik has extensive policy experience as well. She served as a policy advisor to a special coordinator for the Stability Pact of Southern Europe in Brussels. You know, they come with those long names at the European Commission. And for the UN Special Representative for the former Yugoslavia in Zagreb. She also worked for the International Crime Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia at The Hague and the Conflict Prevention Network of the European Commission and Parliament in Brussels. Vesko Garcevic is a professor of practice of international relations at the Frederick Perdue School of Global Studies at Boston University. Professor Garcevic had a very distinguished diplomatic career. He served as the ambassador of Montenegro to NATO in Brussels, to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe in Vienna, and was Montenegrin ambassador to Austria, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Netherlands. Welcome very much. And finally, Susan Woodworth is a professor of political science at the Graduate Center of City University of New York. Formerly, she was a senior research fellow at the Center for Defense Studies at King's College, University of London. She taught, among other places, at Yale University, at Williams College, Mount Holyoke College, and Northwestern University. And she was the senior fellow Brookings Institution in Washington. She's an expert on Balkan and East European history and politics and post-Soviet affairs. I will mention two books: The Balkan Tragedy, Chaos and Dissolution After the Cold War, and Socialist Unemployment, The Political Economy of Yugoslavia, 1945-1990. She also served in advisory capacity to the United Nations and Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. So we are very lucky to have three of you. And let me invite Susan to start our discussion.
This is a very special place for me because a colleague and I drove up from New Haven regularly for 8 years to attend meetings at the center when I was teaching at Yale. So I appreciate the invitation in multiple ways. But today I'm here to propagandize for this book. You can all take a look at it afterwards if you once you've read it, please move on to Professor Kalich's magnum opus, though I suspect it will not be the last, so I should state that in the plural, the Global Cauldron, which Harvard has just issued this year in English translation. As for my comments, I thought it would be fun to play off of these beautiful photographs and talk about that period, the 1950s in Yugoslavia. I give it a tentative title, Myths versus the Archives. Although this does not apply directly now to the 1950s, it is a principle that we should take seriously because of the myths that have been created as a part of the nationalist struggles in the 1980s and 1990s. I learned this most actually from a talk at Harvard some years ago that I gave about Kosovo, and the audience was filled with young people of Kosovar Albanian origin. Their questions to me revealed an almost scary set of myths and ignorance, even though I could understand completely why they had those views. And it made me feel even more vigilant about the importance of serious scholarship, that is, reading the archives. My other principle about this talk has to do with my recommendation for those reading on Yugoslavia over the last 20 years since its violent breakup. Quote, "It depends upon when you start the story," unquote. I wrote this in an analysis of journalists' portrayals of the Yugoslav disintegration in the late 1980s and through the 1990s. Namely, you could predict precisely the date when the author arrived in Yugoslavia by what they wrote. There was never any understanding of Yugoslavia's history or the trajectory of change they were witnessing. So the massive rush of journalists to the territory of former Yugoslavia during the wars added exponentially to the myths about the country. My other prefatory comment I would like to make is to elevate the importance of studying the Yugoslav case even now, but in particular its origins in the 1950s and its subsequent trajectory. In 1985, when Gorbachev had taken leadership in the Soviet Union, I was with colleagues at a meeting who were mainly Soviet scholars. I mean, that is to say, scholars of the Soviet Union. I told them what would happen because based on the Yugoslav case, I knew exactly the trajectory of reform socialism, which Gorbachev was now following precisely as the Yugoslavs had done. We could predict. They all laughed at me, saying, "Oh, but Susan, the Soviet Union's a great power. What would small, insignificant Yugoslavia have to say to it?" They could not be persuaded. Then, the day that Gorbachev introduced the Republic Treaties in August 1991, I was on vacation in California, but I called my boss at the Brookings Institution and said, "This is the end of the Soviet Union." Again, I knew from the Yugoslav case. I was right, and at least he, John Steinbrenner, was ready to hear me, and told many people thereafter that I had accurately predicted the end. But now to the 1950s. The post-war period in Yugoslavia, beginning either with the formation of a provisional government AVNOJ, the Anti-Fascist Council of National Liberation, in November 1943 by the partisans, or the last battle of many throughout the country in 1944 to 45 to expel occupying forces in May 1945, begins to stabilize, I argue, in 1950. Much has been written about the complex political and foreign transition of those years, including the expulsion from the Cominform, the purge from the Yugoslav Party of its political supporters called EBOC, the Cominformists, and extreme international vulnerability and preparation for a new war. Even a very brief run at collectivization of agriculture to get into factories. This is an ongoing debate in the literature that I won't talk about here, but I've seen the archives. Less attention has been paid, I believe, however, to the moment when the economic and political system of the Yugoslavia that we knew for 40 years is created. Despite nearly constant tinkering with legislation, 5 constitutions, with the intense fight over the 6th in the 1980s leading to the end of the country, a roller coaster of foreign relations, and a strategy for industrialization and development that I call in my book, Socialist Unemployment, a strategy in motion, an ongoing process. The political system that emerges in 1950 to 52 sets the framework of a path-dependent process thereafter. I think of 1950 and 1990 as the bookends to socialist Yugoslavia. This is even true about the main architects of 1950 and 1990. It was the Slovene and Croatian party leaders who won the domestic battle over designing the economic and political system, particularly Kardelj, Kidrić, Hebrang, and a bit less Bakarić. In my book, I refer to this as the Slovene model, and it was deeply a result of their own economic conditions and interests and their political ideologies and alliances during the interwar period, and during the war, and immediately thereafter culminating in 1950. The same, as you all know, of course, about the end of Yugoslavia. It was the Slovene and Croatian Republican elections in 1990, then the referendums on independence, declarations of independence then on June 28, 1991, and the Brioni Accord of July that ended the country. For those who are interested in why the Slovenes and Croats in particular, not all people of that name, but from those republics, why they won in the 1980s and 1990-91, please see that discussion in my book, Balkan Tragedy. But the explanation I offer there for the 1980s and 1990 makes it quite clear why they won in 1950, why the system they shaped led to 1990, and why they succeeded in their initiative in 1990. The same story, by the way, of initial founding decisions on the economic and political system, the path dependency those institutions produce, and the difficulty of changing course has been playing out since 1995 in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Locked into a political and economic framework defined by the Dayton Accord and a bit before that, the Washington Agreement. However much some activists in the country, and especially outsiders, and even more so the United States, attempt at constitutional reform. In terms of explanation, however, the Yugoslav system had starting in 1950, had two driving forces: ideology and interest, to use Peter Hall's useful combination. That is, the ideology of those who shaped the system among domestic contestants also served their economic and political interests. And second, external pressures, both active ones by donors and more passive ones by changes in the international economic and political environment to which Yugoslav leaders had to adapt. It would seem that other than the national independence component for Yugoslavia, there is no autonomous role of ideology and interest in the Bosnian case since '95, only external pressures. That's my opinion. My friend Janine Kalik would like probably to dispute that. Although my own personal story when my encounter with Yugoslavia begins is not until 1965. For me, the story of Yugoslavia begins with a speech by Vice President Edvard Kardel, the architect of this new system, on December 29, 1949, speaking to the Third Party Plenum, where he declared, quote, "The most important battle of socialism now, that of national independence through Western recognition, had been won," unquote, with, of course, the change in Western policy. For Yugoslavia was now, he said, considered worthy of material support and military defense as an alternative model of socialist democracy to Soviet, and I quote, "state capitalism and bureaucratic deformation," part of their beginning propaganda at the time. Having decided early on that they needed foreign capital for their development strategy, I refer to this as the Leninist strategy, not the Stalinist, based on the debate in the 1920s of the Soviet Union. The decision by the United States in the course of the second half of 1948 through 1949 to provide loans, facilitate bilateral trade agreements with its allies, support IMF and World Bank missions with all the policy consequences from, as the American policy in the second half of 1948 called watchful waiting, to February 1949 when it changed to keeping Tito afloat, to September 10th, 1949, to all-out support, was this victory for Kardel. The photographs in this beautiful exhibit by Professor Karplus provide an evocative illustration of the social and economic conditions that the Yugoslav Communist Party faced in their goals of industrialization and national independence. Yugoslavia was still an agrarian economy. At the beginning of World War II in 1941, 74% of the population was rural. This was 90% in the southern region of Macedonia. The wartime destruction left the country even less industrialized and more rural than it had been in 1941. Writings by activist I wanted to read this beautiful statement from the letter that accompanies the photographs, where Martin Karplus says, "The main feeling that one gets is one of poverty, in the country as well as in the cities. And just that there are no cars, almost none exist privately, and even the official ones are very rare. Trucks are more common, gasoline pumps, one in a town of 100,000. But in general, people are poorly dressed. Clothing is terribly expensive. A cheap suit costs a month's wages, dinar, 12,000, which is about $50 at the time. A pair of shoes, 1 week's. The streets are not finished, houses just brought to the stage of being usable but not beautified. People sell what most people do. People sell what goods, old furniture, etc. they have saved to survive." Thank you for letting me read that. So that's what they faced. The war, writings by activist intellectuals during the interwar period, the 1920s and 1930s, who included those who would come to lead the party during and after the war, especially the Slovene Edvard Kardel, whom I've already mentioned, and others from Slovenia and Croatia, emphasized in their debates at the time in the interwar period their perception, and that of outsiders, of their backwardness. Incensed by the writings of Marx and Engels on Slavic nations as non-historic nations, relics of peoples, barbarians who would disappear with capitalism, they envisioned the historic mission of the party, the Communist Party, as a substitute bourgeoisie, beginning the process of economic emancipation with cultural and national emancipation. These photos also reinforce the difficulty they faced in the vast differences in economic structures and development across the whole of Yugoslavia. So what are the elements of this system that emerges in this founding period of 1950-52? Number one, the one you all have probably heard most about, workers' councils, later referred to as self-management. introduced in June 1950, and for which Yugoslavia was later renowned, which made all economic enterprises, and later ones in the social sector like hospitals and schools, autonomous economically. Despite what is said of worker control or workers' power, the goal of the councils was to eliminate the union's market power and use economic incentives. Kidrič called it economic constraint, and even went so far, he was the economic minister, even openly called it economic coercion, including unemployment, to increase labor productivity and dominance by managers and skilled workers over wages and investment. Over the years, this was the primary vehicle for firing people, and for the most part, sending them back to the farm, even if they didn't have one to go back to. It created, as I argue in Socialist Unemployment, a dual sector of labor, one privileged and the other discriminated against for the next 40 years. Number 2, decentralization, especially to the republics of jurisdiction over their budgets and enterprises, what was at the time called restoring the republic's, not the federation, but the republic's sovereignty, and sharply cutting federal administration other than on defense by transferring most administration to the republics. This was also a form of economic coercion, as Kidrič termed it, namely to enforce greater discipline on a republic's use of labor and supplies and their budgetary expenditures. At the time, 50-51, Tito exploded over their lack of control over republic's expenditures. The leadership would therefore require Republican governments to be financially self-sufficient, operating on principles of profit and loss accounting. Some of you know this from Khosrow in the Soviet Union. On economic grounds, republics would be forced to release civil servants and professionals to district committees and to firms. Tito and Kidrič referred to announcing this reorganization of state administration in the economy on February 8, 1950, to, quote, a blow to bureaucratism, unquote. Republics would now have jurisdiction over transportation, energy, education, light manufacturing, agriculture, and labor. Also very consequential later was Republican jurisdiction over research centers and development policy. Kidrič also ended the party's special privileges and stores in 1951 and cut the number of party officials drastically. Although the economic rationale under serious economic problems and aims of macroeconomic stabilization at the time are clear, the consequences of this attack on the federal government, such decentralization, in fact, to republics, districts, and local governments, soon to be called communes, had serious consequences, as we all know, looking forward. In addition to decentralization, or what we might more correctly call devolution, smaller communes were also consolidated into larger units, and local social services placed on self-management, that is, economic accounting, footing, and this happened a number of times later. Equally consequential for me was the decentralization of education and culture to the republics in 1950. Given that there was no common Yugoslav national identity at the time, and the question was a major one right after the war, the idea that there would be no federal policy is quite astonishing. One might, of course, refer to the 1953 meeting of linguists in Novi Sad to identify a common standard for Croatian and Serbian speakers, but we know what a disaster that soon became when Croatian nationalists fought it beginning in the mid-1960s and thereafter. In terms of its consequences after 1990-91, even more consequential for me, in terms of the later period, as I say, was the design of defense policy, also beginning in 1950, of creating the territorial defense forces under the authority of the republics to work alongside the Federal Army. Okay. I'm reading slower than I thought. A settled citizen soldiery with training of all citizens during high school and stocks of armaments held by local governments based on the concept of a people's war that was organized within localities and workplaces. Let's see. I was going to go on with more about the idea of the National Democratic Revolution by a substitute bourgeoisie, which I can tell you about later. But let me say the last one that I want to tell you about and leave more for my colleague, Professor Kalik. The last piece was foreign trade liberalization, thus largely directed to export orientation, the global market, and Western institutions, including an active exchange rate policy in 1951. By January 1958, they entered the first stage of membership in GATT, the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, with huge consequences for institutions, policy, and further reforms. People often refer to the economic reforms of 1965 as the reform. That's when I was there, so I can give you many anecdotes, whereas in fact this began in 1958. So I was going to tell you about agrarian reform and then bits and pieces about what was happening on foreign relations in the 50s, but I think my colleague will tell you about this. So the sketch deliberately ends in 1960. I stand by my argument that the system put in place in 1950-51, even though it is reacting all the time to international developments and conditions, laid the basis for the Yugoslav system for 40 years, and also, as I argued, the basis for its collapse. I admit that it was complex, but the basic principles of the system are quite simple and sad. I do not want, however, to add on a sour note. If any of you saw the architectural exhibit at MoMA in New York last year, Concrete Utopia, you will also know of the hugely creative, skilled, and even on occasion pan-Yugoslav contributions from that country to the world, literally. But it does still make me sad.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, let me first thank you very much for the kind invitation to come here and present some ideas about Yugoslav foreign policy, this wonderful event and the opening of the exhibition. These ideas actually emerge from a current research project on Tito and his policy of active coexistence. And I hope they will, in a way, complement Susan Woodward's intervention on internal systemic developments in Yugoslavia as laid down in the 1950s. Now, after the break with Stalin in 1948, Yugoslavia was dangerously isolated. Tito had to redefine not only the political system, but also Yugoslavia's foreign policy orientation. The result was the so-called doctrine of active coexistence, a policy that should guarantee Yugoslavia's independence and territorial integrity, and in particular, non-interference by either of the great powers. Today, I will just briefly elaborate on the historical context of active coexistence before I will give a very brief overview over the main dimensions and instruments of active coexistence, namely Tito's personal diplomacy, the politics of non-alignment, Yugoslavia's activities at UN level, and last but not least, the detention process. My major claim is that Yugoslavia made a remarkable contribution to shaping the Cold War international relations, and it did make a remarkable substantial contribution to overcoming the East-West divide. From the 1950s onwards, gradual opening towards the West and subsequent normalization of relations with the Soviet Union granted Yugoslavia the privileged position of a broker between the confronted blocs. But what does actual active peaceful coexistence mean? The term coexistence entered into Yugoslavia's political vocabulary in the mid-50s. It actually appeared for the first time in 1954 in a treaty between the Republic of China with India, when the two countries agreed on several principles which should shape their bilateral relations, one of them being coexistence, peaceful coexistence. As this concept fitted well to Yugoslavia's political needs, Tito shortly afterward launched the Yugoslav variation of this concept. He spoke of active coexistence and peaceful active coexistence. The new doctrine should provide a global platform to redefine the nature of Cold War international relations. In light of ideological conflicts with China, Tito aimed at distancing himself from China. And he transformed the original version of coexistence into what he called active peaceful coexistence. Because for the Yugoslavs, coexistence was not a simple defense of the status quo, but as Tito underlined, it should become a dynamic progressive process which should lead to a gradual elimination of blocs. In addition to overcoming the East-West divide, being active meant that Yugoslavia supported progressive anti-imperialist movements, liberation movements in the world. The principle of active coexistence became so important to Yugoslavia's political identity that it was enshrined in the 1963 constitution. The message was that it was Yugoslavia that was now at the forefront of this new policy, leaving behind other actors like China, but also India. This led in July 1956 to the most iconic meeting Tito had in this context, namely the meeting with the heads of state of India and Egypt, Nero and Nasser, on the Croatian island of Brioni, where they forged the non-aligned movement, which was based on peaceful coexistence. And this brings me to the 4 dimensions of this new policy. The first dimension is, without doubt, Tito's personal summit diplomacy. No statesman has ever traveled so much as Tito did. Between 1944 and 1980, he made 169 official visits to 92 countries. Altogether, he spent about 1,000 days abroad, nearly 3 full years, and he apparently had never the fear that when he was away from his home country, that some political disruptions would happen. In Yugoslavia, he hosted hundreds of heads of state, prime ministers, foreign ministers, and leaders of political movements. On his ship Galeb, the Seagull, he undertook a number of so-called missions of goodwill and peace travels to Asian and African countries. While some authors claim that this kind of summitry was a mere representation of Yugoslavia to the outside world, containing little substance, or that it mainly flattered Tito's vanity, sources in fact show how much influence Tito exerted, although often only behind the scenes. He often intervened with so-called personal messages, sending his ambassadors to statesmen when he felt urgency in international relations. He also functioned as a link of communication between the blocs where no direct lines of communication existed. For instance, in the run-up to the CECE conference in the 1970s, he managed to convince German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt in a personal meeting to trust the Soviets and to move ahead in a pragmatic way. Later, in preparation of the SALT II negotiations, Averell Harriman in June 1979 wrote to Jimmy Carter, "Tito had convinced me that the present Soviet leadership was very defense-minded." Altogether, in the West, Tito was particularly recognized as an influential leader of the so-called Third World, and thus as a key figure within the United Nations. This power basis emerged from the second dimension of foreign policy, which I wanted to mention, namely the non-aligned movement. After the Brioni meeting in 1956 between Tito, Nasser, and Nehru, in 1961 in Belgrade, Tito hosted the first conference of the non-aligned with delegations from 25 countries. The final declaration was almost entirely crafted by Yugoslav diplomats. It called for world peace, social equality, freedom, coexistence, self-determination, and voiced out against colonialism and foreign intervention. Again, it has been argued that non-aligned appeals for peace and justice were often a wasted paper. True, the Arab states fought wars against Israel and they were quarreling among themselves. Pakistan and India were likewise embroiled in a decades-long military conflict over Kashmir, and many more examples could be mentioned. Yet, Yugoslavia talked to all the sides and helped bridging the gaps. In addition, Yugoslavia engaged in mediation efforts by the non-aligned. For instance, in 1961, during the Berlin crisis, when the non-aligned sent emergency missions to both Washington and Moscow. In all of this, Tito appeared as, I quote Tvrtko Jakovina, the first, most stubborn and dedicated motor of the organization. By doing so, Yugoslavia helped to set topics on the international agenda that related to the specific interests and needs of the global South. And this brings me to the third dimension, the reform of the United Nations system and the development of international law and global governance. Early on, from the 50s on, Yugoslavia advocated for democratization of the United Nations. This included initiatives for the reform of the Security Council, the Charter, and functioning of the General Assembly. The aim was to limit the overriding influence of the great powers and giving the newly independent states a greater say in international relations. For instance, on the initiative of Yugoslavia and the other non-aligned states, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, the UNCTAD, was established over US and European opposition in 1964. Within its framework, developing countries formed the Group of 77. Non-aligned states also initiated the Declaration for the establishment of new international economic order, which was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1974, which declared that developing countries, I quote, should have the right to have sovereign command over their natural treasures. It should be noted that Yugoslavia, when it supported the claims by the southern post-colonial countries, often acted against own economic interests and pursued a value-based policy. For instance, Yugoslavia supported OPEC in 1974 when it raised the oil price, even though this costed Yugoslavia a lot. It costed Yugoslavia $700 million when buying oil, and yet Yugoslavia supported this new policy. While the elder literature maintains that Yugoslavia's influence at UN level was rather limited, new research shows the opposite. It was in Yugoslavia's very national interest to work for juridification of active peaceful coexistence. Therefore, for instance, Yugoslavia pushed the 1970 Friendly Relations Declaration, in which the principle of peaceful coexistence was enshrined. Other important initiatives relate to human rights, minorities, and disarmament. Often these initiatives resulted in declarations that were not legally binding, yet they left a substantial mark on customary law at the time. Think of the ban of biological and chemical weapons, counterterrorism, protection of children, as well as refugee protection. And some of this customary law after the end of the Cold War became indeed international legally binding law. Last but not least, the fourth pillar, European security and détente. The Yugoslavs considered European security key to overcoming the Cold War. In 1970, they presented their own proposal for a European Conference on Security. Later, they played a decisive role in bringing about a major compromise during the original CSCE talks in Helsinki and Geneva, and also in the negotiations of the final declaration in 1975. Yugoslavia promoted in particular confidence-building measures, peaceful settlement mechanisms, human rights and minority rights. Also, whenever the talks at the conference would stall, the Yugoslavs would come up with some new initiative, or at least a suggestion for a procedure to continue with the process. The country was particularly committed to a follow-up process and enlargement of the Helsinki Cooperation, including a Mediterranean dimension, which never happened. Apart from that, Yugoslavia influenced content. For instance, it brought into the debate the issue of sovereignty, which emerged from non-alignment's rhetoric, and was thus carried over to the Helsinki Conference. The Yugoslavs also emphasized respect for the Charter of the United Nations, including independence and sovereignty of all countries, and the banishment of force in international relations, to mention just some aspects. At the end of the day, success of all these initiatives was largely dependent on political will of the superpowers. And the other way around, the superpowers would not have needed Yugoslavia to move ahead with détente. Yet, active coexistence, I believe, produced some concrete outcomes, and this brings me to my conclusion. First, it helped overcoming international isolation of Yugoslavia. It made the country visible and more influential on the international stage. And Yugoslavia did make a difference by shaping international law, promoting European security, and by supporting the global South at the UN level. Secondly, Yugoslavia was an agent of change during the détente process. By providing information, lines of communication, and mediation services, but also by agenda setting, it contributed to trust building, and it reinforced the mood of détente. Third, all of this created legitimacy of Yugoslavia's political system and Tito himself. However, as the détente was proceeding, Yugoslavia's position as a third-party broker was losing relevance, and Western interest and support was decreasing. I guess this will lead us to our next intervention. Thank you very much for your attention.
Is this yours? Okay. Good evening. I'm really privileged to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for giving me the right to speak. I'm one who lived that time. I'm from Yugoslavia. I was born in Yugoslavia. I remember every moment of that country, every moment from the beginning of the breakup up to now. So first of all, I would like to thank Professor Martin Kartus for his excellent photographs. Believe me, it's like driving back home. When I don't remember that time, I'm, thanks God, younger, but I remember country very well. And I was overwhelmed with emotions a couple of days ago when I saw first time your photographs online. So thank you for giving me this opportunity to revisit my country in another time. So we here, at least at the first point, can agree that Yugoslavia doesn't exist. But I would say Yugoslavia exists. I will give you an example. Just a few nights ago, in a town when I live in now, Belmont, I was visiting my beekeeper to buy some homemade honey. And since he is originates from Italy, he emigrated to the US in 1949. I wanted to tell him when I come from, and I mentioned Montenegro. He, by default, didn't recognize country I come from. Then I used the very final argument. Just across the sea, just across the Adriatic Sea. Oh, Yugoslavia. Oh, Yugoslavia, I said, and that Yugoslavia still exists. And I wanted to tell you, therefore I want to focus, I live this time, I joined the diplomatic service of Yugoslavia at the very last moments of its existence. Then I, without moving anywhere, served several countries, what is called small Yugoslavia, which I didn't like, I have to say. Then Serbia and Montenegro, then finally Montenegro. But here I would like to talk about something else. I would like to talk about narratives, because, Yugoslavia has been deconstructed, but narratives of what Yugoslavia was and what Yugoslavia meant didn't deconstruct yet. And we can see here nowadays, and I experience that every night when I read about Yugoslavia, read anything that now is written in what I consider cultural circle of Yugoslav cultural circle, how people speak about Yugoslavia, consider Yugoslavia as being somewhere floating in the air, and how I recognize that narrative which appeared 20, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, and the story that actually began as the war of narratives, to be turned into the full-scale war, continues again as a war of narratives, a struggle of narratives of what Yugoslavia was and what Yugoslavia meant. And I will just pick up a couple of things that I consider important to understand why it's happening, because the war is over, but it is not the end. And I will tell you at least how I understand why it's not the end. I don't want to play down some other very important factors that contributing to the end of Yugoslavia. Definitely economic crisis, economic decay was one of the critical one, maybe the key one. So then the political legitimacy of Communist Party. Communist Party was not able in 80s to address very complex issues, some of them stemming from economic crisis, which for the first time led people to believe that a Communist Party is not competent to lead country, and that somebody else may be able to do that better. So then I don't want to speak about that. I would like hear about structural factors contributing to structural problems, contributing to the dissolution of Yugoslavia, such as dysfunctional federal system, captured by national oligarchs or national political elites, national communist parties. So then institutions, as I said, democratic deficit, definitely, and the lack of the culture of democratic dialogue, an atmosphere for dialogue, because dialogue and public and political debate was badly needed, and the atmosphere and the framework was not healthy and conducive for dialogue to take place. So, but for me, what is essential here, and I would like to highlight, is the persistence of national historical narratives in Yugoslavia, by which many peoples in Yugoslavia cast each other as the enemy of one another. So Yugoslavia, at the very end, failed to provide a common historical narrative broadly acceptable for its peoples. The narrative that was used was a child of communist revolution. It was upgraded a couple of times throughout years, over the decades, but was not effective enough in early 80s and 80s to substitute, to become glue for Yugoslavs to believe that they still belong to the same country, and that they see the future in the same country. It was working well as long as party was able to provide for good life in 70s or in 60s. But once it was not able to provide that, and then, that made the way to other narratives to pop up and to grow. So, interesting enough, nowadays, what I can experience, and people reading in our languages, I said in our languages, if something made me polyglot, is the breakup of Yugoslavia, because now I speak several languages. At the moment when I was born, I speak Bosniak, I speak Serbian, I speak Montenegrin, I speak Croatian, and so on. So, if you read this, then you will be surprised. You will be surprised how this old narrative, Yugoslav narrative, has become or has proven to be more resilient and coming back, bouncing back to be used by people against the one which they compete with. So I will tell you then that if you want to, roughly make a distinction between those two groups, that what we call one group Yugo-nostalgic or Yugo-nostalgia. It's a cultural and political phenomenon occurring among citizens who remember Yugoslavia. Those citizens like me or older than me, And interesting enough, it's particularly vivid in 4 smaller republics of Yugoslavia, which means that those people living in those smaller republics, one of them I come from, believed, thought, or still believe and think that Yugoslavia was a good framework for their peoples to live in and to prosper. Just to tell you, in their understanding of Yugoslavia was a state of social justice and meritocracy, because they believe that it was almost like a mythical state where the rule and order was in place. And there were people with high ethical norms lived respecting one another. So, and in their views, everything was better in Yugoslavia. What I can add to this, since I know diplomatic services of several countries which created upon ashes of Yugoslavia, and I remember the very last days of that big Yugoslavia, I can say that all these new diplomatic services, including the one I served in my country, Montenegro, are just jokes in comparison to that one in terms of professionalism, in terms of understanding of the global affairs, in terms of impact making on global affairs. But I have to recognize that rise of Yugo-nostalgia has more to do with discontent and frustrations with present-day conditions and political elites ruling those states than Yugoslavia itself. When they compare Yugoslavia and what they have right now in front of their eyes, they recognize why Yugoslavia was a better option, at least in their opinion. Then the second group, the group which I can call Yugo haters. Why? In their eyes, Yugoslavia was a dungeon for free people. It put chains on national freedoms. It was the place where liberal ideas, artworks, or liberal individuals are put either in bunkers or prisons. So I would agree with them too. Yugoslavia was not a democratic state. It was one-party state at the end of the day. And really, people who were liberal, particularly in the 70s, had problems. Their movies and artworks were put in bunkers. Many ended up in prisons. So, but I would say that it's not a hidden agenda of this narrative. Is something has more to do with the legacy of Yugoslavia and what happened in the World War II, and the very idea how Yugoslavia came to being and who played the role and what role in the creation of Yugoslavia. Why legacy of the World War II? There is one interesting fact, which is, that was a revolution, communist revolution. But at the same time, it was an anti-Nazi fight. And Yugoslav revolution was recognized internationally after Tito-Churchill meetings in 40s as, some contribution to the anti-Nazi fight. And, in order to delegitimize Yugoslavia, Yugoslavia should be stripped of its anti-fascist character. So therefore, we have narratives by which, others, particularly coming from those who during World War II did things that they could not be proud of. So they would like to, they would like to put question over moral and crimes committed by communists during the World War. They would like actually to equate them with those who were collaborators at that time with Nazis. They would like to cast shadow and smear Yugoslav character of Yugoslav revolution, which at the end of the day, as I mentioned, was recognized in 40s, in 50s by internationals as such. So the second thing, which is also very important in the eyes and minds of some, is why Yugoslavia was created. And what was the role of Serbia in its creation? They don't challenge the very idea of Yugoslavia and idea for South Slavs to live in one country, which was born back in 19th and 18th century. So they just challenged this moment of the creation of the first and the second Yugoslavia as something which was just served Serbs only, and their ambition to fulfill their statehood ambition through Yugoslavia, and order to be like treated more equal than others within that state. So I see arguments even today, as of a couple of days ago, lately, mentioned by some politicians. I don't want here to take sides and mention any names, but mentioned along these lines, questioning the legacy of the World War II, legacy of Yugoslavia, questioning the very idea of how Yugoslavia was born and who played which role in its creation, questioning, the role of particular nations behind it. So those who do that, they present themselves as victims of Yugoslavia, as ones who suffered a lot in Yugoslavia, as ones who were subjugated to Communist Party. Don't take me wrong. I don't want to say I don't want to portray Yugoslavia as perfect. I would like just to say why it's so important to understand those two lines going on. Even this night, once it is over, when I come back home, when I open up some websites, either from Slovenia or from Croatia or from Macedonia, Serbia, Montenegro, I will see the same stories going on over and over and over, and people using the same arguments. I can recognize from time when I was working in Daily Borba. Just to tell you, for you who don't know, Daily Borba in the late 80s, was the only daily against Milosevic in Serbia. And just to portray that for a moment, atmosphere at that time in Serbia, I experienced a few times commuting back from my office to home, reading that newspaper, that people are spitting at me. So, because it was one confronting the narrative, nationalistic narrative of that time, not only in Yugoslavia, not only in Serbia, everywhere in Yugoslavia at that time. And my concluding point is, just a few days ago, I read an article, op-ed, written by a guy who is laureate of the EU Prize for Literature, who wrote, what would happen, he posed the question, if somebody in Yugoslavia create a software, Tito software, who would be fed with Tito's ideas, Tito's thoughts, and also with something what happened after his death. And then that software answers and provides answers to questions and challenges we are facing these days. His point was that people would vote for software, not for politicians. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you for those interventions. Now you know how exciting are the countries which are forgotten. Because we have a very little time, let me propose the following thing. I will open the floor and we collect as many questions and comments as possible, and then we'll go back to the panel in the very end and you will comment on, you will not have to comment on everything, but pick up some ideas and questions which you think are interesting or put new light on issues. So, okay, so the floor is open, please. Yes.
My question is for
Could you please
Professor.
introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry, Janet Farrell, a private mediator, and I worked in Bosnia and in the region from '96 through '02 in peace building and helping people reconstruct their lives. I was wondering if you have any sympathy for Mr. Milosevic's views.
The floor is open.
Gilead, I'm a mathematician, nothing to do with the topic other than knowing some Yugoslavian. I relate to the comment of Dr. Kalic. Would it be correct to characterize many of the, by principle, activities of Tito and Yugoslavia as trying to walk this narrow cusp, including, say, take the example of the oil embargo? They couldn't affect the oil embargo, so they didn't lose anything by, they could say that the moon is green. They could benefit from being on the good side of the oil-producing countries in the long run. They could benefit in the wider scale of a very interesting comment you had by being protecting the very tenuous existence by having many people dependent on the good offices. Would that be a correct statement?
The floor is open.
Ogden Ross. I'm just an observer of what Yugoslavia has been going through. Before Tito, the region was known as the Eastern Crush Zone. And then Tito unified. Now it's separated. Do you think that, I believe you were talking about the possibility that it was better as a unified entity as opposed to a bunch of separated entities? And what do you think the direction of it is going into the future?
Searching for one more. Let me add the question to the portfolio of questions. You focus on the post-Second World War developments in those three interventions. Yugoslavia was created, of course, in the wake of the First World War. How important was the war experience? Really, could you say that the task of keeping the country together or creating the country after the First World War was as difficult as keeping the country together after the Second World War? So how this past and past war and pre-war experience related to one another? More questions? Yes, please.
Vladimir Petrovic, Boston University. So there is a claim which is also mentioned for another vanished country, Austria-Hungary. There is a claim, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but it was incompatible with democracy. And this claim is often mentioned in Yugoslavia as well. So I'm curious if that's your response.
And I saw one more. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Miras. I'm a junior at the college. Yugoslavia still remains an extremely diverse region, even despite the mass exodus of people between 1995 and after. During Yugoslavia, there was a large incentive made wondering if is there any incentive now, and could there be an incentive to in some way or create some type of alliance?
Okay, I think we have a lot of questions. So let me go back to the panel and ask you to respond to some of those at least. Susan, would you like to start?
I wouldn't go so far as to say I have sympathy for Milosevic, but I do think that a very good part of what was said about him was simply factually wrong. And it alerts one to the ability of small nations to use public relations firms, especially in the United States. Both the Slovenes and the Croats spent 3 years before they declared independence preparing the way. I met with a delegation from Slovenia in September 1990 at the Brookings Institution, so I have even a sense of how not just the PR firms, but their delegations all around were very effective. It's hard to know what would have been if there hadn't been that argument made in order to be able to leave. You know, there's no right to secession in international law. So what would have happened if some of the negotiations, especially from the Bosnian and Macedonian presidents in the course of the 1990s, who wanted to keep the country together, what would have happened if there hadn't been this brilliant PR strategy? So I think that's what I would say. It's a really interesting question. Then at a certain point, Guess went into a lot of trouble. I don't see, just in terms of the questions people have been asking, direction in the future, no incentive to reunite. I don't see any, except, you know, the young people who about 10 years ago were going around the country, former country space to listen to all of the rock bands that they used to love. There was this sort of moment of nostalgia, but I don't see any incentive. And I think the best person to answer the question that you posed about after World War I and II is Professor Kalik. She's written about it.
Professor Kalik?
Yes, should I? So there was one question about Yugoslavia's foreign policy and the question whether or not it would have benefited in the long run. I mean, this was the idea of Yugoslavia's, all the activities it undertook, that in the long run, Yugoslavia would benefit from it, even if in the short run it would have to pay a certain price. But then, as we all know, this did not happen, and Yugoslavia's activities worked even, contrary to its own interests, because Yugoslavia thought by overcoming the East-West divide, the world would be secure, and Yugoslavia interest could be safeguarded in a better way. But then it turned out that it was quite the opposite when the East-West conflict was over. One of Yugoslavia's pillars of identity was destroyed, and many of the forces which kept Yugoslavia together disappeared, like the Soviet threat and other elements. Now, the question of war experience is rather is an interesting and complicated one. The first Yugoslavia in 1918 was composed of very different territories. So one part where those territories belonged to the Habsburg Empire. These countries unified with Serbia and Montenegro, which already existed as separate states. Now, the interesting thing is that in World War I, the people who lived in these territories found themselves on different sides, warring parties. So the Croats and Slovenes and the majority, and some of the Serbs were fighting for Austria-Hungary against Serbia and Montenegro, which made that at the end of the war in 1918, Yugoslavia unified winners and losers of the war and had to find a way to, or a commemorative practice and an historical narrative which would reconcile this fact that there were winners and losers, and Serbia emerged as a big winner of the war, despite the huge loss it has experienced. And against this background, the experience of war, the death, hunger, refugee, forced migration, and all that, in a way, worked as a unifying force, which could reconcile the fact that there were winners and losers. And we can see this concretely in the commemorative practice and in the war memorials. These war memorials show, there are many war memorials built in the interwar period, which were memorials for both sides, more or less, for those soldiers, Serbian soldiers, Montenegrin soldiers, but also soldiers, Croatian, Slovenes, and for different religions, which is quite interesting. I'm not so sure about the Second World War because the situation was different, because this was also a civil war, as was said before, and it was more difficult to find the common narrative, although it existed as partisan struggle and unity and brotherhood, which Pledo propagated already during the war, and which then made it possible to make a distinction between those who were fighting an ethnic war or were collaborators with the fascist and Nazi regime, and those who were fighting for freedom and were communists and partisans. So history is always a means of making sense of the world in which we live, but you can pick up whatever you wish, or you can, draw the narrative as you like it. And I guess this is what Professor Garcevic was also underlining in his intervention.
May I make a couple? Yeah, sure. First of all, regarding Yugoslavia and some third Yugoslavia, new Yugoslavia, I would say that Yugoslavia exists, but as an internet cloud world. So something like that, I don't think that there is a chance or incentive for reunification of peoples who once lived in Yugoslavia. I don't see this in a foreseeable as an opportunity. I don't see, I have to say, political interest of elites that lead country, former Yugoslav countries, to unite again as Yugoslavia. Maybe one day in the EU, if we ever fulfill criteria. But that's for another story. So as far as a question concerning Milosevic, you can imagine what I think, because I was there, and I don't think I have no good opinion about him and what he did for Serbia. I wanted to tell something. I don't know whether I see some people from Serbia here. I wanted to share something with you. I think that Serbia and Serbian communists for decades were most liberal communists in former Yugoslavia in 50s and 60s. Many communists from Slovenia, for example, decided to flee country when they had problems with their own communist party, when they were at odds, and to settle down in Belgrade. It changed somewhere in the mid of 70s, in 70s, because somebody mentioned Kardelj, you mentioned Kardelj. Kardelj was ideological father of Yugoslav communists and very conservative thinker. Whereas another guy, Stipe Dolanc, another Slovenian, was running secret service, Yugoslav secret service, was power behind the throne. That changed in 70s, changed with the process of purge and the purification of Serbian Communist Party. Communist Party in 70s, Putin, purged party from liberals. When you do that with liberals, you actually pave the way for nationalists to come. If you kill one, then others grow. So as a result of it, what we have in 80s and even today in Serbia is that the political scene is predominantly national, conservative national, with just few voices of liberals here and there. We are struggling to gain ground and to get more than 4 or 5% when they run for elections, to gain more than 5, 6, 7% of voters for them. So I see this as the legacy of what happened in the 70s. Maybe I'm wrong, that's my private opinion, and I know, and I've read many books of those who were at the time purged and who are still active in Serbian politics. And I really highly respect what they did and what type of ideas they fought for in 70s.
We have time for a couple of more questions. Yes.
Oh, this is kind of the big thing. I come from the Middle East, I'm Israeli, and the entire map of the Middle East was created artificially. And we see the wars that are subsequent to that in Iraq, the civil war in Syria, Israeli, Jordanian, whatever existed. It looks to me that Yugoslavia was one of those artificial creations that the powers decided to map the world out of the breakdown of the empires. And it is, in fact, the war, in a very profound way, a consequence of this internal tension of an artificial creation, or was there some natural cohesion?
Let me follow up on this. Can the EU learn anything from Yugoslavia?
There was I can't remember the name of the Bulgarian sociologist in Vienna.
Krastev.
Yeah. So Krastev had two conferences about 4 years ago. The lessons, one was the lessons of the Soviet disintegration for the EU, and the other was the lessons of the Yugoslav disintegration for the EU. It was actually very interesting, and I said yes, lots of lessons for going that way. But one of the things that's so much fun about history is contingency. Who would have predicted the effect of Brexit on more cohesion at the moment within the EU? So, hard to say. I wanted to add, I'm very allergic to this term artificial, because that was part of the propaganda of the Slovenes and Croats, saying they could justify leaving because it had been an artificial state from the beginning. In many ways, what you said about the Middle East, almost all states are artificial. So what does that mean in terms of a political argument? And Professor Kalik can tell you a great deal about the forces within Yugoslavia fighting for Yugoslavia, but at least most prominently starting in the middle of the 19th century. So I think that it's a very important story that had very little to do with the way in which the Versailles powers broke up the empires. In contrast, perhaps, to what was going on with Britain and France against the Ottoman Empire. But I wanted to answer your first question also, because one of the things that I'm not quite sure how much Yugoslavs, that is to say, people who lived through the 50 years of the country, appreciated this, which is that Tito's foreign policy included, it was brilliant. What Professor Kalik has talked a lot about the policies and the institutions and so forth, but what he did for Yugoslavia, starting in 1948, was to get IMF loans and World Bank loans and American aid over and over and over again. Now, I'm very critical, as you can tell, because it required ever greater decentralization and not much of a hole left, and that was because of these policies, especially the IMF. I mean, it begins with Cardel's idea, but it gets reinforced by the funder donors. But it meant that people did live beyond their means, is to use the term that the IMF and the World Bank said. They had, extraordinary quality of life. Yugoslavs could travel to more countries than any other country. People, people's nations. The passport went more places than for anybody else. So even though Professor Professor Gacevic referred to the economic crisis in the 80s, about which I've written a lot, that was sort of coming, the debt crisis unfolds in a particularly bad way for Yugoslavia. Up until then, they benefited a lot by this Tito policy domestically.
Professor Kalik?
Yeah, Yugoslavia was not an artificial state because the Yugoslav idea emerged in the country. It emerged actually first in Croatian lands in the early 19th century with the Illyrian idea, which then developed in the Yugoslav idea. And this meant, this idea actually meant that the South Slavic people were related people, that they had a common origin, spoke the same language or similar languages, had same culture, and should form one single nation and have their one single state. So this idea was a local idea. It was not imposed from the outside world, and it had some good arguments because languages and cultures were so close, and in many areas people and religions lived so intermixed. If you look at the map, you would actually see that the Yugoslav idea in the 19th century made a lot of sense because there was not a thing or an easy way of dividing up these intermixed areas to specific criteria. It was even so that the great powers in 1917, when the Yugoslav representatives declared they wanted to create Yugoslavia, were very hesitant. So that the Yugoslav politicians, the Yugoslav committee, had to lobby in London, in the United States, in Europe for that state. So that, I mean, the idea of creating Yugoslavia was local, it was in that not artificial, but Yugoslavia was a very complicated and complex state. And when Yugoslavia was created, the different communities, in particular the Croats and the Serbs, had already the idea that they should not be merged in one single South Slavic nations, but that they had already their own national identity. So there has always been a tension between the aim of creating a common state and keeping, these different national and religious identities. And the first Yugoslavia had a different answer to that problem than Tito's Yugoslavia. The first Yugoslavia gave the answer, let's create one single nation, unitarian nation, with a centralist constitution, and the legitimacy would be, through the king, and then let's end the discussion. Whereas then in Tito's Yugoslavia, communism had a different idea, that this should be a multinational state, this should be a federation and a communist state. At the end of the day, the question of legitimacy arose in both Yugoslavias, and the difficulties to keep the countries together. It's very similar in the first and the second Yugoslavia, but this did not mean that this was an artificial state.
I know that we are running out of time, so I will be brief. Definitely your question, as Benedict Anderson said, all nations are imagined communities. So Yugoslavia was an imagined community, and it had chance to be transformed into a modern, prosperous state. We lost that chance. Actually, we screwed up in '90s, and I cannot blame anybody else but us, because at the end of the day we were in control. So, but coming back to the question about the EU promoting this event, I tweeted recently that Yugoslavia was a good idea, but due to structural problems, ceased to exist. And I got back a tweet from a friend of mine from Macedonia and Albania, who is a sociologist, asking me whether I referred to the EU or to Yugoslavia.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Please join me to thank our panelists for this wonderful exchange. I have great pleasure to say a few words on behalf of the curators of the exhibit. One of the reasons that we have the gallery at the center is that sometimes the photographs and images can tell you more about society than stack of books and scholarly analysis. And when I look at those photographs carefully over days, I thought that we can see in those faces the forces which in the end ended the Yugoslav state. And I think that there are like three dimensions to those photographs and to those forces. So first you see the impact of modernization and how disruptive modernization is in traditional societies. And it's disruptive in cultural dimension, it's disruptive in political dimension, and people are very resentful of the fact that this modernization develops in very uneven way. So that's one impression I had from the photographs, and I think that Susan has written about this, that this modernization process in Yugoslavia was very uneven and quite often contested. The second thing which I see in the photographs is the depth and staying power of ethnic and religious identities. We tend to forget about this or disregard that, both liberals and communists and others, and we are brought back to earth to realize that how powerful those forces are, and you see those forces in the faces of those people. And then finally, what you see in those photographs is the power of non-democratic system, the power of repression, which doesn't solve anything. The forced ideas, the forced ways of trying to modernize people, trying to abolish their ethnic and religious identities brings the opposite effect. And I think this is amazing that we look at those photographs from the 1950s and we see the end of Yugoslavia in those photographs. Let me thank Professor Jan Kubasiewicz, who is the curator of the gallery, and he's still teaching his students in the Massachusetts College of Arts, but he will join us hopefully shortly. And Bettina Birch, who is the assistant curator of this exhibit. And it's my great pleasure to introduce to you the artist, the real artist who captured those images. Psychologists told us over the last few years that very distinguished scientists have very often great artistic talents. And I think that this is definitely the case supporting the discovery. So Martin Karplus is Theodore Williams Richard Professor of Chemistry Emeritus at Harvard University. He was born in Vienna. The family had a good fortune to be out of Europe before the Anschluss of Austria. He graduated from Harvard College, got PhD at California Institute of Technology, and came back to teach at Harvard in 1966. He received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2013. When he graduated from college, parents bought him a small Leica camera, and he traveled world with that camera, taking images in many different countries, in many different places. Those images were exhibited again in many places. Martin, it's a great pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing those images with us, with our community, and please, the floor is yours.
Well, first, I want to thank you and Jan and Bettina, and particularly Gila, for making this exhibition possible. Without all this cooperation, maybe better than in Yugoslavia, it wouldn't have happened. Now, a number of people have asked me, what was I doing there? How did I happen to go there? And I thought it might be interesting to say a few words about why I was there. I mean, some of the things have already been mentioned. I received my PhD in 1953 from Caltech, from working with Linus Pauling, and then decided that I wanted to do postdoctoral studies in Europe. I wanted to go back to Europe. And so I applied for a National Science Foundation fellowship. This was one of the first years when they became available. I obtained this fellowship, and I decided to go to Oxford. But I felt that in going back to Europe, I didn't just want to do science. I wanted to do something more than science and get an experience that I could get with the freedom that this fellowship gave me. And in some sense, the fellowship had two important advantages for me. One was that it was $3,000, which was quite a bit of money at that time. And I and Gary Felsenfeld, one of my colleagues who also came to Europe, bought a Volkswagen Beetle, which permitted us to travel around. The second part of this fellowship was that it said that you should obey the customs of the institution where you were working. Now, I may have taken this too literally, but Oxford, as many of you know, has terms of 8 weeks, and then all the rest of 3 of these terms, and then all the rest is a vacation. And so the students in Oxford actually, during the 8-week terms when they had to be in residence, mainly had a good time, and then did the real work during the 6 weeks of vacation when things were quiet and nothing was going on. I, of course, interpreted the fellowship as saying I should be in residence for 8 weeks, and I was. And then during the between-term vacations, I traveled. And having the Volkswagen Beetle made it possible to go all over Europe, from as far north as Norway to as far south as Greece. And as already has been mentioned, my parents gave me a Leica 3C camera, which was a superb camera. And also at this time, Kodachrome film, color film, had just become widely available, and it made these little, in fact, I think I brought one along. You made these little pictures like this. And some of the photographs actually that are in the other room were taken directly from some of these. Others were scans, but if one looks at them, they look the way they did when I first took the pictures. And the main reason is that we very rarely looked at them, and Kodachrome is very stable in the dark. And it lasts, people say, 100 years or so. If you look at it in light, it decomposes very rapidly. But fortunately, like many people, we didn't look at them very much. As I'm sure people know who nowadays with iPhones and such. Maybe it's also worth mentioning that Kodachrome, the resolution of Kodachrome, which is 150 pixels or so in a certain sense. It actually doesn't have pixels, it's continuous rather than that, is as good as the best camera that exists nowadays. So that's why some of these pictures, which are this small size, could be blown up to about 10 feet by 10 feet and still would be perfectly in focus. Now, in these travels, we took I took photographs, and I realized after a while that actually these photographs, which were mainly of people, as you can see here in one of them, were my record of what was happening in these countries, which would be gone 10 years afterwards. And so it's really this, as already has been mentioned, not only did it talk about the past, but apparently it also talked about the future, which was, and basically, I mean, we went all over Europe, as I mentioned, but the pictures here are a selection of the one that we had when we went on a trip between Trieste and Greece. And when people ask me to talk about my pictures, I usually say they should speak for themselves, and they have to a certain extent. But it may be worthwhile saying something more about the picture that's shown up there and there. And it's a government official, and I can say that I know what's going on because in those days, in the 1950s, many of the people still spoke German, and I could speak German, so we could actually communicate. And so the fishermen had sold some of the fish to the government official. He was going to go off, and then they had some fish left over, and they decided to make a fish stew, and they invited me to participate in that. That's one part of the picture which isn't really there. But the other part, which I think is worth mentioning, is this line that goes up here. And it just happens to have the orientation that you can't see what it is. It's a ladder. And it's a ladder that one of the fishermen climbs up, and he throws down rocks, and the rocks make the fish go into their nets. So that's what's hidden in this picture. And then if we went to the gallery, almost every picture has a story behind it that is not always evident. So I shouldn't waste more time and let you go to the pictures and see what you find there. It's really a pleasure to be here.
I like your message. It's very CS friendly. That even if you take long vacations, you can still win the Nobel Prize and become a great artist. So, thank you.